Greetings and welcome to my channel. This is Sorcerer Tal. You can also find me on Facebook in the Sorcerer's Guild. Today on Sorcery Self-Defense, we are going to be talking about traveling in shadows. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, there are a few different things that I mean by that, and we're going to be dividing it into two separate portions. First part, traveling in shadows, we're going to be talking about very literal using sorcery for self-defense, as in remaining unseen, traveling without being seen. I have one video on that already about obfuscation and approaching invisibility, but we're going to be focusing on shadow techniques today and get into quite a bit more detail on that. And then we will talk about entering the shadows when we are in dream work or astral projection, as well as how to use shadows and darkness to attempt astral projection onto the material plane, and even a form of remote viewing that works in the darkness. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. So, traveling in shadows on the material plane, or literally hiding in shadows. The most important thing to remember when we are doing this type of work, well, first is perception. It's not literally about how far back you are in the shadow, it's whether people perceive you or not, yeah? Okay, because we're trying to avoid being perceived. So, the next is that darkness and shadow are not something you can draw upon, yeah? You can't pull darkness and shadow. They are not matter. They are absence. They are lack, as we have talked about before. And so the idea then isn't to draw shadow, but not to reflect light, not to draw awareness through the reflection of that light and perception. Okay, so the mundane aspects of this are, well, obviously don't wear too light of clothing or or exposed too light of skin when you are trying to be in shadows. But on the opposite end of this, don't be too dark either, yeah? You don't want to be the dark spot in the darkness, the shadow in the dark, because that draws almost more attention than the thing that's lighter sometimes, if people are already scared and looking, yeah? And that brings us to another idea there. Scared and looking, but also movement. When we are when we are trying to stay in the shadows, the magical part of what we are going to be doing there, if you have your shadow gloves on, if you have your shadow gloves, ideally you want to be wearing them, and you actually want to imagine yourself entering into the shadow, but not drawing it to you, like I said. We're not drawing shadow to you. You go into the absence. And then, if we are going to be using anything to obfuscate ourselves, as far as colors, we don't want any bright colors, obviously, or any light colors. We don't want anything super dark. We want to go for something that matches the night itself. Different shades of shadow. Yeah? There are different shades of shadow, and we want to match those for what we are doing. But also, we want to enter into that and allow ourselves to enter into the mental paradigm of staying within those shadows, and that is where we want to stay. That's where we want to be. It's almost like the light is lava, yeah? Remember playing The Floor is Lava as a kid? This is entering into that as a concept, because the more you go into it, the more this idea takes shape in your mind. But also, people think of those smooth, slow movements as being quiet and sneaky, yeah, like this. Not really, because, well, that constant movement, that slow purposeful movement, that's another thing that draws the eye. So we are dealing with perception. People don't perceive something as moving that moves very slowly, and not jerkily, but like a chameleon, yeah? You ever watch a video of a chameleon, how it moves its hands? And it's not smooth. It's not smooth at all. It's got these little jerky motions. That is how we move when we're moving without being seen. And I know it sounds weird, probably looks a little funny on the video, but that's the point. To not move within what people perceive as motion. Yeah? Looks a little funny. You will see when you watch most animals when they are trying to move silently. I mean, yeah, a cat slipping in the grass where he can't be seen will tend to be very smooth, but that's because they're trying to avoid making noise. When they're actually trying to avoid being seen, the movements are not smooth. Like I said, with a chameleon, you see this with lots of different, not with your predatory animals so much, but especially with deer and that sort of thing, you actually will see this very hesitance to the movement. You don't move smoothly, you move hesitantly, hesitatively, very, very languid, very careful of every little bit of it, so that nothing draws the attention. There is no smooth bit. There is nothing outside of what one expects to see with simply the swaying of a tree branch and that sort of thing. See how a tree branch sways and it kind of... It's not perfectly smooth, yeah? Neither would the shadow of it be. So, these are the type of things that don't draw the eye. And that is what we are trying to do here. When we think of not drawing the light, that is a metaphor for the eye, and that is what we're actually trying to avoid. So, there is that there's the mundane aspects to it, and in that idea of entering into the paradigm, but also, people just don't tend to have... But then there's also the assuming the right aura of that sort of thing. And this isn't just, oh, I am darkness. Shadow itself doesn't have a vibe. Yeah? And though I say traveling in shadow, the shadow itself doesn't have a vibe. It takes on the vibe of what is around it. So, when you are entering into this state, when you are trying to make yourself less easily seen, less easily perceived in the shadows, you don't imagine yourself becoming shadow. Again, you take on the vibe of the full environment, as does the shadow. Because that's what the shadow is. It cloaks that is already around it. And you have to become part of what is around you in order to share fully in that cloaking. So, the mental paradigm that you enter into, the thing that you try to blend in with, is that you will imagine yourself and your aura, and then you will begin letting yourself feel outwards for the vibe of where you're at. And I mentioned that hesitancy, that shakiness, that's going to be in the rhythm of the place. And this is where you pick that up, yeah? You find the rhythm of the shadow, of the area that you were in and its vibe. And you will need to allow yourself to melt into it, to become part of the environment. Because the shadow is never empty. There are always things in the shadow. There are always things that the shadow is now part of. Well, that the shadow is that is that the shadow is now cast upon. There are always things, many things, in the shadow, besides absence of light. And it is within this vibe that we enter. Okay. So, there is the idea, of course, of shadows within shadows. And this is, well, we're getting into the mundane. We're very much getting into that piece between the material and the astral, where the mundane meets the magical, and that shadow within shadows, that stepping behind the tree that is in the darkness. Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a good place to hide mundanely, but when we have that vibe, that feeling of the tree, and we learn to catch its rhythm of how it sways with the wind and as the branches move, we want to kind of get into that, yeah? And then we can step from that shadow and still almost seem part of it as we step from one tree over to the next. And what we do, if we do this properly, within the rhythm and the motion and the energy of what is already there, even if someone is looking at us in the darkness, if they don't already know we are there, it can be made to be perceived as a swaying of branches, as a motion in the wind. And that's the sort of thing that, well, yeah, you have to get the vibe for. That's where that in-between piece is. It's hard to argue that was magic, and it's hard to argue it was just somebody doing a thing. And the more you learn to walk this in-between, this twilight between the material and the physical plane where shadow realm dwells, the easier it's going to be to walk or travel within shadows. Okay, so the next part, which of course these segue into each other because that's where that starts, yeah? And we're gonna start with the material plane side of it, and then work on and then talk about the astral stuff, because they're the same thing. But really this first part is the same thing, but how we can learn to astral project onto the material plane and walking within that twilight of the shadow realm starts with that shadow within shadows, that vibe, that feeling oneself become part of the rhythm as things move. Because there is never stillness. Nothing is still, yeah? Light is motion. Light is energy. Light never is still. And neither is shadow, which is the absence of light. There is a motion, a flow, a rhythm to all of this. And when we find ourselves in shadow, shadow within shadow, in the darkness, we can enter into that vibe, into that rhythm, by simply expanding ourselves out and into it. And then we move our bodies, like I said, that is where we can learn to enter that in-between realm and actually physically move with less chance of being seen than if we were not. And the other is, well, to leave the body itself there and step out into the shadow. And this is done, again, you might want to be wearing your gloves for this, as we've talked about in previous videos, but this is done by entering into that shadow, and then as the movement takes you, rather than stepping, sidestep. It's the same as when we astral project. There's just that moment of pushing. And obviously one would want to sit down when doing this sort of thing, but typically we want the eyes to remain open because we are entering into that shadow and walking through it. We don't bother closing the eyes. The eyes no longer matter. So you would be in the dark, find a spot of darkness within the darkness, close your eyes or open them. Either way, actually, like I said, eyes don't actually matter. I typically do it with my eyes open, and then I turn around and say close your eyes, but anyways, in the dark, in the darkness, looking at other shadows there and allowing oneself to enter into the rhythm and the flow of it, and allow that flow of the shadow to enter into you and become that twilight, and then flow out. And the easiest form of this is the remote viewing. And as we do this, your eyes tend to do it with my eyes open. Most people probably find it easier to do with your eyes closed, but you are supposed to be in the darkness. So there's not a lot of like light hurting the eyes, that sort of thing. Anyways, you look into the dark, enter that flow of the shadow, and then focus on that which you wish to see that is in the shadow. Now, the interesting thing about this is it tends to only work for those things which are also in the darkness. If you're trying to look at somewhere that's daylight while you're trying to look into the shadows, you're only going to see what's beneath the trees and the crooks, what's behind the closet door, that sort of thing. This is literally looking from one shadow into another. But we can also even astral project into these places through this traveling of shadow. We can remote view into those places, but even flow into them and astral project so that we're not just seeing, but putting our will and even into those areas and being able to generate energy and cast from within the shadows of those locations. And this is one way that we can actually get into areas that we don't have any kind of a link to, because everywhere has shadows, yeah? No matter how bright a light, it always casts shadows on the ground. So, this is a way to enter them spaces that are blocked. Not just we physically can't go there, because there are places in this world that are blocked from scrying by many means. Shadows are an area that are of absence. You can enter through absence and look at places that are otherwise guarded through regular scrying. These are ways to enter into those places. Anyways, the Vatican may have very strong opinions on such matters, and I'm not suggesting anyone go astral projecting into the Vatican without protection, astral play of the shadow realm, that sort of thing. Yeah. So, anyways, while we are on the subject, I do have a few updates that we can talk about. I mentioned before that shadow work can be used not necessarily to directly harm another person, but it can make them become very confused, make them fall over and different things. And well, frankly, I just wanted to do some updates on that because I've seen some evidence of this using the shadow realm to enter things. Like I said, it cuts through other ways, even when it's someone who has is in the public eye, someone who has popularity about them, and there's someone that is known. Because like I've talked about, even those who are protected perhaps by whatever type of magic they use, these shadows are a way to cut through that. And when we're dealing with public figures as well, public figures have everyone's thoughts around them. Thoughts, hopes, dreams, aspirations, fears, whatever. Anytime you have a public figure, there is a thickness of thought. More people are aware of them, and you have to be able to cut through that to be able to affect that person, especially if you don't have any type of link to them. So these shadows, they are a way to cut through many of those different things, and I have some confirmations as to what exactly can be done with that. If you look back on some of my videos, I actually posted a little bit on something that I was doing. I didn't say what I was doing, and I'm still not going to. But there's a certain public figure that not long after that had a very bad stumble, and since then has been pausing and glitching out in the middle of speaking. And well, that's been happening ever since I decided to use them to test some of these things about the shadow work and how it can work on a target. Anyways, again, I'm not going to say who that was or anything like that, but it's very interesting because since then they've had several issues, and though they were considered a very important person not before that, since then, their career has taken a sudden turn, not just because of the glitching and the unexpectedness, but people just perceiving them in a darker way, and their career is about to come to an end, it seems. So, anyways, that will be it for this episode. Thank you once again for joining us. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please take the opportunity to do so now. Until next time, bright blessings and an interesting fate. This has been Sorcerer Tal.